There are proposals on the street that the Nigerian authorities should increase value-added tax from the current 5%. That's been in place for a number of years. That suggestion came from the IMF a couple of months ago. Well, it's now resurfacing again because the government's revenue is shrinking from oil and non-oil. So if you have to raise value-added tax, what are the intended and unintended consequences of doing that? Will Nigerians be able to cope with 7.5 or 10% value-added tax? That's the question I'm putting across to Siri Agbe, who is in charge of tax and regulatory services at the PricewaterhouseCoopers. Good morning, Siri.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Should we increase value-added tax?
So I'm a strong proponent for no, do not increase value-added tax.
Why?
Many reasons. One, that our Value-Added Tax Act needs an overhauling. And then two, because of the economic hardship in Nigeria today, increasing it would only increase it further, and perhaps not the best for citizens of the country at this time.
So you stand on the side of the people?
Yeah, to some extent. But I mean, for another school of thought, of course, is to say, how does Nigeria's VAT rate compare with ECOWAS countries? And I think that's also where the IMF boss was coming from, looking at the revenue generation we're getting from tax as a nation and whether or not that is even being utilized to sufficiently offset our debt levels, which had significant pressures already. And so one of the areas she had spoken about, of course, is VAT. And the intention is that with an increase in that rate, we would increase our tax revenues. And by increasing those tax revenues, we would have more to support the infrastructural growth that the country badly needs and also provide the services that the country is in dire need of.
Whether it's VAT or personal income tax or whatever, the government always consider the reason, the rationale for either lowering it at a particular point in time. I'm not sure any government ever lower tax, but it's always higher, perhaps somehow. But in terms of where we are in West Africa, what's the consideration before a country like Nigeria says we're going to set VAT at 5%, or we think we should take it a little bit to 7.5 or maybe even 10%? Is it because the citizens can afford it, the economy can generate it?
So the VAT, the concept for VAT, it's basically a consumption tax. For any services or goods that you consume, you should pay tax to the government. And that tax is supposed to be passed on from level to level so that it's only one layer that effectively suffers the tax. The 5% rate came at a time when it was pretty much a new concept to Nigeria, I think in the 90s.
Yes, it was the middle of the 90s.
Exactly.
Yes.
Since then, there's not been any review like we would expect year on year. And this is what we expect the senators to do, that we would review the VAT Act year on year and even all our tax laws so that they effectively match with the realities of the economy. Now, the economy has fast outpaced what we have currently in the tax laws so that they don't even effectively address the realities of business. So
you think in a GDP heading towards $600 billion, you think a 5% VAT is small?
Oh, it is.
From a technical analytical point of view.
It is really small, woefully small. And in fact, recently the finance minister spoke about the compliance rate, which was disappointing to say the least. Nigeria currently has a 12% compliance rate when it comes to VAT. And this 12% rate is only as it relates to registered entities. So we're not even speaking about those that are not within the tax net. If we had to go beyond and include those within the tax net, that compliance rate will probably fall down to like 5%. So even with our current 5% rate, we're not even reaching out to collect the tax.
Maximum.
We're not doing the maximum. And if we're not doing the maximum, increasing the tax rate still would not fetch us what we expect.
So in other words, it looks like we're just going to keep penalizing those who are paying.
Paying currently,
rather
exactly.
than expand the dragnet and bring more VAT in.
That's very
So
correct.
on whose doorstep does this land?
It effectively lands on us, me and you as consumers.
Oh,
we suffer it effectively. But again, I think one thing I wanted to point out from the Act, which is the second reason I'd mentioned earlier for why it requires an overhauling, is our VAT system is pretty much like a sales tax. The VAT is such that you get a relief for the VAT that you've suffered at the time you purchase goods. That's how a typical VAT system.
Sure.
You offset it against the VAT on your sales, so that the net impact keeps going back to the final consumer, and there's no ripple or double impact or double hit to us as consumers. But right now, there's a restriction on how much relief you can get, how much relief a company that makes your teacup, for example, can get on the purchases he's made and the VAT he's suffered.
With the tax authorities?
Yes. And that's because of the way the Act is defined now. So the Act would restrict how much you can claim to offset that your VAT on sales.
So it goes. So in other words, the retailers and fast-moving consumer goods, which generate the bulk of it, don't keep say, look, I have to raise prices because.
Spot on. So they have to raise the prices indirectly
and pass it to you and I.
Pass it to you and I, so that effectively, even though we see 5% on the surface as what our VAT rate is,
we're paying more.
We're paying more, exactly. So that's one critical area that we need to change. And the VAT Act, I think, there have been moves to say we should update that Act. There's been a draft Act that I think an Australian person had assisted us with.
Yeah, PwC.
Not PwC.
At the federal level.
At the federal level. But that Act hasn't been submitted yet to the Assembly for even deliberation.
Who has the document?
The document is sitting somewhere.
Somewhere, sitting somewhere. Not on this table. I've just looked, I just checked.
Here.
It's not here. It's not in the studio. I'm sure it's sitting somewhere.
But hopefully we would, bring that back.
Whether with the Joint Tax Board or with the
exactly,
FRS.
We'll bring that back with the FRS
or the Ministry of
then
Finance.
Begin to revisit, where we should actually be as a nation in terms of a proper VAT Act, not just a sales tax act. And by the time we put all this in place, perhaps it will then be a gradual process for us to then get to that higher VAT rate, so that we're comparative with the ECOWAS countries.
In other words, we shouldn't even start talking about increasing VAT by any stretch of imagination. We should deal with the laws, regulations surrounding it, and the Joint Tax Board and everybody in there should think about it. Because the first consideration and the other line is that we're talking about the consumers, but we need to go to the companies, those that are charging VAT. Like you said, it's not just the consumers, but the companies are also going to be impacted.
Yes, and then also increase the tax net. So like I said, the compliance rate right now is about 12% for only those that are registered. We haven't even spoken about those that are not
12
registered.
out of 100%.
Exactly.
We're doing very, very badly.
Very badly. So we have to widen that tax base, bring in more people to register for VAT, and then we would see definitely a significant amount of increase in that VAT space. But then we would gradually evolve into whether or not we should be charging a higher VAT rate. So it's a lot of steps required, but then I think it's something that's achievable.
In terms of how do you folks at Pricewaterhouse look at this issue?
So it's pretty much some of these, but I think some of the discussions we've also had are the level of tax cases and case law perhaps that we have on VAT. So one other thing that we have, or gap we have in the VAT Act, is that there are gray areas. One major one being that there are certain concepts that are not properly defined in the VAT Act. And because of that, it gives rise to disputes with the tax authorities. When you compare our VAT Act with other legislations in other countries, you'd see the huge gap that exists, for example, in the definition of basic goods or services, which should be VAT exempt. But those basic goods or services are not defined in our VAT Act. What does that mean? It means that for those of us who are supposed to charge VAT, we're pretty much confused as to whether or not we should charge VAT on a certain item because we don't know whether it qualifies as basic.
Under the basic goods.
And because it's not defined in the Act.
How is it defined elsewhere? What are basic goods that should be VAT exempt?
So some of the definition would seek to just take into consideration items that are pretty much staple. And because they are staple, it drives the reasoning behind why we exempt them from VAT. Because the VAT is a fiscal tool to impose taxes on luxury goods ultimately. And so there are certain rates that would apply, different rates that would apply in a proper VAT system, such that for luxury items, for example, you wouldn't pay the same rate that you would pay for VAT as a good like gari or bread or wheat, or any other thing like that that's pretty much staple for the economy, because that's how you use it as a tool to drive revenue growth.
So in other words, if I have a bottle of Hennessy, I should
you
pay
pay VAT at 15%.
I should pay VAT at 15%.
Exactly. But again,
really?
this is just a guesswork. I'm not
No,
saying it should be 15%,
yes.
but I'm saying maybe that's the way we should be
Because
looking at it.
It's not a staple.
Exactly, because you're the rich guys. If you buy a jet...
But I'm not the one, I'm just saying.
You're not the one.
I'm not the one, but I'm just giving an example.
For the ones who buy the jets.
Yes, for those who buy jets and,
yes.
and buy
so luxury
luxury
items like that. Yeah, and then the basic ones should probably be exempt.
Was that the reason why Nigerians complain, sometimes grumble about paying tax of VAT? Because if I'm buying bread, a bottle of Coke, I'm buying pastries, and buying, I don't want to say, some noodles for children, they can look at the youths and what have you. Why should I pay 5% on a piece of bread?
So it's something that's contentious, honestly. It's not like in every VAT system you shouldn't pay VAT just because it's staple. At some point you would judge based on the economics of scale and say whether or not this is something you want to implement going forward. To the extent that there was any scarcity, for example, as it related to wheat and in the production of bread,
sugar.
Maybe what we should be using VAT for is to say we don't want to impose more hardship on people because bread is a necessity, and therefore make it exempt. So we classify bread in that regard as something that's basic, and we exempt it from VAT. But as we begin to see the economy prosper, and we do need taxes from these people who are enjoying from the social services that the government is preferring,
then you can kick it in again.
Ease it in again. Exactly.
Yes.
So that's how it should work. It's not
so
like...
we shouldn't have tax laws that's dated 1993, and this is 2016. Hold on, folks. We're still reading from the same old book.
Correct.
So in other words, you see at Pricewaterhouse, someone who's in tax, to think we should be having the tax conversation almost under every budget fiscal year.
Year on year, and that's what we see even in developed economies, and even in Africa. Kenya does a review of their tax act every single year. My colleagues in PwC would sit a day before waiting for the budget to come out because they know there's something always to be analyzed from a tax perspective and advise their clients thereon. But for us here, there's a huge gap. Some of the discussions that are being held at the National Assembly are so void of tax, and at the end of the day, when the budget comes out, you wonder then how tax is being used as a tool for addressing economic change.
Hasn't the current administrators at the government level been talking about let's increase tax, we're going to bring more people in, we're going to expand the corporate income tax and personal income tax because we need money? Isn't that the right conversation?
Yeah, it's the right conversation. Is going in the right step, but it's not all that there is to it. So what's being done right now in expanding the tax base is to say, let's take a look, for example, at withholding taxes. So withholding taxes would be that I withhold from you if you supplied service from me, and I remit it to the government on your behalf. So they have a record of someone like you in their tax net. Now, because they have that in their tax net, they can go back to you and then get the rest of the tax, because that withholding tax is only an advance payment of the income tax that's due from you. Now, whether we've done that consistently over the years is questionable. In fact, I don't think it has been really done. So what the government is doing now is to say, for all of those databases where we have some of this information, let's even harness it properly. Let's consolidate the information or databases we have across various agencies. For example, where you go to the company registry to register a company, just by registering that company, we already know that you're a taxable person. We give you your tax identification number and begin to follow up year on year for the tax collection due from you. So there has been that huge gap, and that's what I think the government is starting up with.
Siri Agbeyi, thank you very much. We'll have this conversation. Since history, tax is always contentious.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks for
having me.
We appreciate it. Siri Agbeyi, head of tax and regulatory services at PricewaterhouseCoopers. We'll be back after the break. We're talking about non-oil expanding our export base.